If yes, ma'am, I got the rights back to me. Yes, ma'am. जी मैम जी. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Mhm. Yes. क्या करें? हाँ, of course. हम्म. अच्छा. मैम किससे बात कर रहे थे? अच्छा अच्छा, ओके. ओके. अच्छा, ओके. एमपीडी एमपीडी से रिलेटेड. हाँ. जी जी जी. यस मैम. जी. यस मैम. ठीक है. क्या करें मैम? मैम बस वो हाँ ड्राफ्ट कर लिया. आई एम जस्ट अबाउट टू सेंड. शैल आई सेंड? हाँ. यस मैम. यस मैम. मैम शैल आई इनवाइट? मैम इनवाइट करूँ क्या मैं आपको? चलिए. मैम क्या है पी डॉट एच है ना? इसमें ईमेल आईडी तो लिखना पड़ता है ना? ठीक है मैम. यस मैम डन. तो एक तो ये हो गया मैम. और ये एक मैं जो लाइव वाला एक बार आपको भेज देती हूँ. इफ इट इज फाइन देन आई सेंड द मेल. मैम आई एम जस्ट व्हाट्सएपिंग यू. यस मैम. मैम आपको पहले वहां से लॉग आउट करना पड़ेगा जो आपने वेबएक्स लॉग इन किया हुआ है ना. हाँ. मैम विंडो मीटिंग की तो बंद हो गई होगी पर जो ये वेबएक्स इवेंट्स जो आपका क्रोम पे खुला हुआ होगा एक विंडो. वहां से साइन आउट करना पड़ेगा. NKN MNIT दिखा रहा होगा. मैम मीटिंग वाली विंडो तो हो गई एक और. हाँ जी. यू हैव टू साइन आउट फ्रॉम दैट. यस मैम. फिर आपको जो मैंने लिंक भेजा है ना अभी व्हाट्सएप मतलब मेल के. यस मैम. और मैंने आपको एक यूट्यूब का भी लिंक भेजा मैम. एक बार आप वो भी ट्राई कर लीजिए. इफ इट इज वर्किंग एट योर एंड देन आई विल सेंड इट टू ज्ञान ऑफिस. श्योर मैम. जी जी. हाँ जी हाँ जी. आई विल डू दैट. यू आर देयर. Yes ma'am, you are there. I'll make you panelist. Yes ma'am, I've done that. मीनवाइल आप एक बार वो यूट्यूब का लिंक ट्राई कर लीजिए सो दैट आई कैन सेंड द. ठीक है मैम.
Good evening. A very warm greetings to you all. On the third day of GIAN course on South Asian Literature and Film 1990s to present. Today we have Professor Ulka Anjaria with us. The title for the today's session is 20th Century British Literature, 20th Century Bhasha Writing. So, for before beginning with the session, there's a gentle reminder for the session for all the participants. Like, if you have any question, so please ask at the end of the session, and also try to put your queries in the Q&A section. So, over to you, ma'am. The session is yours.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. You are audible.
Great, thank you. And can you see the shared screen? Okay, great. Okay, hi everyone. Nice to see everyone again. The theme of today's 3 lectures is focusing on questions of language. And so that is, we'll be discussing that in the past and in the present, and picking up on some of the things we already discussed yesterday. So we'll begin with the first lecture of the day, which is the 20th century Bhasha writing, with a focus on Premchand, Vibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay, Tarashankar Bandyopadhyay, T.S. Pillai, U.R. Ananthamurthy, and although Isma Chugtai was not on the original program, I have added her in for today. A couple of things to note, even though this title of the course is 1990s and beyond, you might ask, why are we talking about 20th century literature before the 1990s? And also, since the focus of the course is on literature of the 1990s in English, why are we focusing on Bhasha writing from an earlier period? So there's 2 reasons we're doing that. One is the importance of situating any historical period within a larger historical period. So when we say 1990s and forward, we don't want to forget that nothing new or magical happened in the 1990s. It was still building off things that had happened in the past. So we always want to be attentive to the past, even while we focus on one period. And this theme that we've been discussing already for the past 2 days, and we'll continue to discuss today, is whether English deserves its place as an exceptional language in the study of Indian literature. And, in a sense, there's a lot of categories. Indian writing in English is a category, Anglophone writing is a category. And certainly the more you come outside of India, in the US and the UK, many departments, English departments and colleges and universities are structured around the idea of the global Anglophone, English language literature outside of Europe and the United States. So because of that, English does have some kind of exceptionality, but it's more institutional rather than based on English literature being actually different and better than other Bhasha literature. And we talked about on Monday, we talked about how Rushdie had said in his introduction to Mirror Work, an anthology, that his objective evaluation was that Indian literature written in English was better than Indian literature written in other languages. I think that's very false, and I think everyone agrees that's false, but because we don't have access to all the languages, sometimes it's hard to kind of prove otherwise. So the goal of today is just to give you a very brief survey of some important figures in 20th century Bhasha writing, so that we can draw some interesting connections between past and present. So one thing to note in terms of terminology, one of the words classically used to discuss Indian literature and Indian languages is vernacular. Vernacular meaning languages people speak. And that was the colonial word used for Indian languages. So I'm using the term Bhasha instead, and I'll explain why. Well, really, it's 2 reasons. One, the concept of the vernacular comes out of Christianity, where where Latin was the church language, and then the languages people spoke were the vernaculars. So as you can see by that, in that history, there's a hierarchy built into the term vernacular, where there's the higher language, and then the vernaculars are kind of the lower language. And that is confirmed by the fact that the word vernacular etymologically comes from the word for a household slave. So the idea is this is a language that kind of, slaves or servants spoke in ancient Rome. And I think that's a real mistake to think of English as some meta language and then all the Indian languages as lowly languages. So I think the word Pasha, there's no perfect word ever, but the word Pasha suggests that a more equal plane, that there's, that there are many languages that people speak in. They're not high, they shouldn't be ranked in terms of hierarchy. Obviously, bhasha is also a bhasha term, so it feels a little more appropriate to what we're talking about. There is a question that's been lingering throughout our discussion this week, and will continue to, is whether English is a bhasha or not. I kind of like to think of it as Indian English as a bhasha, as a language people actually speak, not some kind of higher language. But again, this is some of the discussions we'll be having today when we discuss the question of language. So another preliminary is that, the topic of 20th century Bhasha literature is very broad and huge. As you know, there's many languages in India, many, many different writers. And so I just want to emphasize that I'm not covering every writer, every language. I'm leaving things out. And that's only because of our constraints in terms of time. But please don't think this is a coverage of, the only important writers. There's many, many important writers, and we're just covering a few just to give you a sense of the rich diversity out there. And so, yeah, so we can, I think it would be interesting to add other writers to this conversation as well. Okay, so to begin with Premchand, who is, probably one of the most significant Hindi Urdu writers. Premchand actually started writing in Urdu. He's actually known mostly as a Hindi writer, but he wrote his early works in Urdu and then kind of switched over to Hindi, and in the 1930s. He was born in a village near Allahabad, and his works are known mostly for his use of realism. So he was interested in writing about the real people of India, and was very much focused on village characters in the village. But he was interested in everyday characters, like just the farmer, the farmer's son, the milkmaid, the people who kind of comprise the everyday life of India's villages. Um, and that includes everyone, so from different class positions. So he was interested in landowners and their families, political reformers, tradesmen, shop owners, money lenders, and regular men and women, peasants, sweepers, outcasts, prostitutes, laborers, and their families and children. So his interest is really in humanizing people, and showing a kind of common humanity. So often in his books, he writes about elite people and subaltern people in the same book. And I think he's doing that very much to show that, that everyone is a kind of human. He had a very humanistic impulse. So he was known, his politics, he was known as a Gandhian kind of political thinker. And that's, I think, why he was so interested in rural life. He really believed there's something special about Indian rural life, very much influenced by Gandhi. But he was also a major figure in the All India Progressive Writers Association, which was formed in 1936, and included writers like Mulk Raj Anand, Ahmed Ali, Sajjad Zahir, and later Ismat Chugtai, who we'll talk about in a second. So this was a group of writers who came together in the 1930s, and said, what can writers do to support the cause of Indian independence? What is a writer's contribution to political change? And this was, there were many debates. Some of the writers were Marxists. Premchand himself was not a Marxist, but some of the writers like Sajid Zahid came in really from Marxist perspective. Others were trying to think about how Marxism would fit in the Indian context, and what it would look. But the main question everyone was asking is, like I said, what can a writer do for a political cause? And so they had very interesting discussions. Premchand actually wrote the opening speech of the AIPWA meeting in 1936, and the speech was called Sahitya Ka Uddeshya, which is the aim or purpose of literature. And in this, he articulated some of what he thought writers could do for Indian independence, but not just for Indian independence. What writers could do for a political movement? What is the role of writers in a political movement? And also, what should literature look like in moments of political change? So these were some of the questions that Premchand tried to answer in this speech. So one of the things he says is, we call literature a work which expresses some truth, whose language is mature, polished, and beautiful, and which has the ability to leave an impression on the heart and mind. In literature, this power emerges in full when it is the truths and experiences of life that find expression. Although we once used to be impressed by stories of magical adventures, ghost tales, and romances of parted lovers, now they hardly hold any interest for us. Undoubtedly, a writer who knows human nature can describe the truths of life, even in tales of magic and in love stories about princes and princesses, but this confirms the dictum that in order for literature to exert any influence, it necessarily has to mirror the truths of life. So this actually became a quite important statement when it came out, for the reason is that this line in literature, the power emerges in full when it is the truths and experiences of life that find expression. And you can see that this is a kind of manifesto for realism. What Premchand believed and what many writers believed is that literature has to be based in the realities of the world. And once it is, it can actually take human society forward. The criticism here is of magical adventures, ghost tales, and romances of parted lovers. And of course, here he's referring to long traditions of mythical, epical, prose, and poetry in all the Indian languages, which were much more melodramatic, much more kind of much more figurative, much more romantic. It wasn't very interested in the real grittiness of everyday life or of the human condition. And so that was one of the things that Premchand really believed, that we can't, it's irresponsible for a writer in 1936 to be writing ghost stories or fantastic tales. The writer should be writing about the real India, the real people of India, and that's how India will make progress. Another line he says from the same essay, our literary tastes are changing rapidly. Nowadays, literature is not just meant for relaxation, it has a further aim apart from entertainment. It no longer only tells stories of happy and unhappy lovers, but it ponders on the problems of life and solves them too. It no longer seeks inspiration and vigor from wondrous and stupefying tales or allure in alliteration, but concerns itself with issues affecting society and individuals. Currently, good literature is judged by the sharpness of its perception, which stirs our feelings and thoughts into motion. So again, Premchand was representing what was a common view in this period by progressive writers, which is, again, that literature is not just for relaxation. It shouldn't just be escapism. Shouldn't just be entertainment. It has to actually ponder the problems of life. It has to talk about current problems, and not just about independence and colonialism. Actually, that's not even what he was referring to, but real life problems embedded in the real lives of people living in India, in South Asia. And so again, this became a very powerful statement for a kind of realism in Indian literature. And the last quote from the same essay, it is the duty of a writer to support and defend those who are in some way oppressed, suffering, or deprived, whether they be individuals or groups. He pleads justice on their behalf and considers himself successful when through his efforts the court's sense of justice and beauty is awakened. So just two things to point out here. This is the strongest political statement that Premchand makes in this essay. It is the duty of a writer to support and defend those who are in some ways oppressed, suffering, or deprived. These are debates, of course, that have been going on in literature and among writers for centuries. What is the role of a writer? Does a writer have to represent you know, the poor and the subaltern. And I think, you know, he wrote this in 1936. I think it's very prescient. These are still debates people are having today about what the role of writer is and what the political role of a writer is. But the second part of the quote is also interesting. He pleads justice on their behalf and considers himself successful when the court sense of justice and beauty is awakened. So it's not just that you have to write boring political treatises, but you have to inspire and awaken something in the human spirit that makes that sheds light on the people who are oppressed, suffering, or deprived. And that is the difference between literature and other forms of non-fictional writing. It's not just the empowerment of those who are suffering, but it's also awakening our sense of beauty and emotion. So Premchand has, you know, has written, is very prolific, was very prolific, and wrote many novels and short stories. His major rural novels set in rural India, Premashram, Rangbhumi, and Karmabhumi. And his most famous novel is Godan, which was published the year of his death in 1936, and the same year as the founding of the All India Progressive Writers Association. So Godan is a very interesting novel. I think probably his best novel in terms of some of the stylistic, formal, and language elements in it. It's the story of Hori and Tanya. So Hori and Tanya are farmer family, and they have 3 children. They're struggling to find food and work in rural United Provinces, which later, after independence, became UP. So at the beginning of the novel, they try to increase their social status by buying a cow. And of course, Godan is translated into English as the gift of the cow. So they decide they want to buy a cow, and they're hoping that the cow will provide milk for their children, and you know, and then maybe they can sell the milk and they can kind of make some more money that way. So Hori goes and buys a cow, thinking it will increase their wealth, but he spends all his money and takes out loans in order to buy the cow, and very quickly the cow dies because it was poisoned by a jealous neighbor. And that happens in the very beginning of the novel, and the novel is just one disaster after another. The death of the cow, their inability to pay back the mortgage. Meanwhile, their son Gulbad begins an affair with a kind of wealthier woman, and so he is kind of off doing that. Debts pile up. The family finally tries to mortgage its land, but they kind of spin out of control into their financial precarity. Um, Meanwhile, there's a generational conflict as well, because Gulbad hates that his parents are so passive. Everything that happens to them, they say, this is our fate. This is what God intended. And Gulbad, who is the younger, you know, he's an adult son, but he feels like, you know, there's actually moneylenders who are greedy and who are corrupt. There's corrupt zamindars. The wealthy is exploiting us. And so he kind of has a much more of a rebellious streak. So he moves to the city to try to find work, but of course, nothing is great in the city either. And so the novel is very strong, obviously, criticism of the conditions of poverty and the way that the poor, if you're poor, there's like no way to get out of that. Even if you try to do something like buying a cow, you are like trying to get yourself out of poverty, but you ultimately can't because the system is too stacked against you. Um, so and so the novel is very much a critique of that. It's a very kind of sad novel, but on the other hand, it's what I think its success is that it really beautifully represents the humanity of its characters despite these terrible circumstances. So, um, you know, it's a mistake to think that just because someone is poor that they like have lost their soul or their spirit. And Hori and Tanya especially are represented really with a kind of intimacy, a realist intimacy that makes them very humanized. Their flaws, their their good characteristics, their qualities, also their flaws and their failings. And same with Goba. They're all represented very sensitively. And this is just one passage that gives you a sense of what Premchand's representation looks like. Defeated again, Danya brought Hori's stick, jacket, turban, shoes, and tobacco pouch and flung them down in front of him. Hori glared at her. What's this outfit for? You think I'm going to your father's house? And even if I were, it's not as though you have some young sisters there that I should dress up for. A trace of the smile softened his dark, sunken features. I suppose you think that if some gorgeous young thing were there, she'd get a big thrill out of looking at you. Hori folded his tattered jacket carefully and placed it on the cot. So you consider me an old man, do you? I'm not even 40 yet, and men are still lusty as bulls at 60. Not ones like you. Go look at your face in the mirror. Just how are you going to be lusty when you can't even get enough milk and butter to make a few drops of ointment for your eyes? It scares me to see the condition you're in. Makes me wonder how we'll manage in our old age. Whose door will we beg at? Hori's momentary mellowness vanished as though consumed in the flames of reality. I'll never reach 60, Tanya, he said, picking up his stick. I'll be gone long before that. And this is a good example of what I mean by, like, even though they're poor, it's not like they're just kind of victims or silenced in this. There's something very intimate about the dialogue they have. And even in this short passage, they move from like kind of flirtatious banter, like, oh, here's some clothes. Well, what do you think I'm doing? And oh, maybe you like flirting, she says to him. But then, of course, very quickly, the reality of their condition sets in. And Hori says, oh, I'm not, first they flirt, like Hori's like, I'm not an old man. But then she's like, well, look at you, you are. And then she's, worried about what they're going to do in their old age. And then at the end, he's just like, well, I won't even make it. And so that, there's like a very domestic intimacy between husband and wife that's represented there, and you can see that no one's a stereotype. Hori doesn't act stereotypically. Tanya doesn't act stereotypically. Even in a short passage like this, they're light, and then they're serious again, and that shift, I think, is very realistic and marks a real humanizing of the peasantry. And I should say that before before the Progressive Writers Association, figures like peasants and farmers were not really, it was rarely represented with a lot of intimacy. They're much more kind of like, stock figures in the background of conversations, more middle class people. So I think this really, and even in Premchand's earlier works, he sometimes has people, he sometimes has people speaking in ways that isn't very like realistic. And so I think Godin really marks a kind of a progress for him in terms of humanizing and intimizing, making more intimate. Okay, the next author we want to talk about is Bibhuti Bandopadhyay, a Bengali author of dozens of novels and short stories. He's especially known for Pother Panchali and its sequel, Oparajito, which you probably have heard of because Satyajit Ray turned these two novels into 3 films in the 1950s, called Pother Panchali, Oparajito, and the World of Opu. And then because of that, the stories became very famous. He's also known for another novel called Arnyak, but he's actually written many, many, many books. Now, he's an interesting figure because unlike Premchand, he actually wasn't involved in politics or the progressive writers movement. He's known more often as a modernist, and that's partly because when you read him, there's like really a mix of styles. Sometimes it'll be very he worked for the civil service as a forest official, so he spent a lot of time in nature, and some of his books are really about nature and about the forest. And some of them are set in the city. Unlike Premchand, he was much more interested in kind of how to transcend the real world. He was much more interested in, and not in a spiritual way, but in a like existential way. Like, what does it mean for where you find true humanity? Not when you're in the world, but kind of when you can experience something that transcends the world. And that I think is different from Premchand, because Premchand was very much into kind of like the gritty spaces of real India, real village. So his novels are not really interested in figures like shop owners, beggars, or hawkers. He's much more interested in kind of people who don't quite fit into the world and who want to transcend it. In Oparajito, he describes shop owners, beggars, and hawkers as The men who live in little lanes, who do nothing all day but chat about the latest scandal or the price of fish. Even on such a beautiful evening, none of them would dream of going out anywhere. Their minds are incapable of imagining there's a world outside. I think you can see from this quote what I mean, that for Vibhuti there's something kind of degraded in like the regular human person. And again, that was, different from the progressive writers, but also, also an important kind of modernist moment in Bengali literature. Um, so his heroes tend to be regular people who are able to transcend the kind of pettiness of life. So Poter Panchali is the first novel, and Oparajito here is the sequel. Poter Panchali tells the story of a Brahmin couple, Horihor and Shorbajoya, and their two children, Durga and Opu, and as they struggle to make ends meet in a Bengali village. Durga and Opu share a close relationship, and they explore the world around them. And their childhood imaginations run wild. And again, you can see that like his interest in children is how they like take the everyday world and kind of transcend it and make it something magical. And so Durga and Opu in Poter Panjali very much have that relationship to the world around them. Um, Durga is impetuous by nature. She's kind of always getting in trouble with the neighbors, like stealing their mangoes, and other kind of antics that no one likes. But actually, she has a tragic death in the novel early in as a child. And Opu is still too young. He's the younger brother. He's kind of still too young to understand what happened, but he misses his playmate. The tragedy devastates his parents, and they move to Kashi, Varanasi. But there, Horihor passes away, and now it's only mother and son. She has to find a job, and that's kind of where Poter Panjali ends. And then Oparajito picks up where that novel ended, in the same house. So Shorbajoy gets a job, the mother gets a job, and Opu gets a job to officiate as a local Brahmin in religious ceremonies. And so Opu cooperates for a while, but he just can't live in the village. And again, you see that theme of like the young man who just can't live in the village like everyone else. Like he needs to do more, he needs to experience more. And so he ends up moving to the city, moving to Kolkata, to go to school, go to university, and he does very well in school. But then even that, he doesn't have enough money. And he also is not good with money. And again, you can see that kind of there's a romantic side to Vibhuti Bhushan's novels where there's someone who just can't quite live in this world, and Opu is definitely like that. So he spends too much, he can't control whatever money he has, and then he doesn't have enough to eat. So he kind of drops out of college too. And he ends up getting married, has a son, um, Kajol, and at the end of Oparajito, he like realizes that he can't really take care of his son, and he leaves his son with his mother's father, and then travels around trying to earn money, and finally decides to go to Fiji to work in a school, and the novel ends there. So the story in the novel is very episodic. It doesn't look, and this is something that we discussed yesterday. If translation helps novels gain a global audience, helps Pasha novels gain a global audience. In the case of Poter Panchali and Oparajito, it's like it's not just it has been translated. It's been translated multiple times. Well, Poter Panchali has been translated multiple times. But the thing about it is that it's not. It doesn't really look like a Western novel in its form. It's very episodic. The chapters kind of end and another one begins. You don't really get the sense of a story. There's no real meat of the story in it. And so it's not just, even what I'm trying to say is, even when it's translated, it's still somewhat inaccessible to a global audience. I'll talk about the film in a second, but Poter Panjali, like when it was first translated, the translator was a British translator, and he was like, I don't understand most of what's in this. I mean, he understood Bengali, obviously, but he just like took out big chunks of the novel because he was like, it doesn't fit into a novel. So what I'm trying to say is translation is not just about language, but it's also about form. Now the ending of the story is sort of strange because in Oparajito, like he has this son, but then he leaves the son right at the end and goes off to Fiji. So it's a kind of, again, there's no like closure or ending in a way one might expect from a traditional novel. Now, if you've watched the film, or the trilogy, you know that so what Ray did is he took the second novel, Oparajito, and made it into 2 films. So the 3 films in the trilogy, but there's not 3 novels, just 2. But it's funny because like Ray changed the ending also because, as I said, in the novel, the Opu leaves his son behind, and in the film, he doesn't. He actually returns back to his son. And for those of you who've seen the final film, this is kind of the iconic image of that. And Sumitra Chatterjee, who's the actor, is kind of like every picture you see of him is this image. And it's basically the image of reunion, the image of returning to his son, which is exactly the opposite of what happens in the novel. So Ray also must have felt his own dissatisfaction with that lack of closure in the novel. And I think that was Vibhuti Bhushan's style. Like he wasn't really interested in telling a complete, and he just wasn't interested in like beginning, middles, and ends. All of his writings are more like middles. And so I think Ray wanted to turn it into something that was more emotional and more cathartic. But what's funny about this is the English translation of the novel actually has the same image in the front, but it's funny because that image, that reunion actually never happens in the book. So the book cover represents a scene that never actually happens in the book. It only happens in the movie. So that I thought was interesting. And also it's a case of how filmic adaptation actually kind of fixes some of the problems with the original novel. And I have to say, I mean, without Ray's films, probably people would not have heard of these novels because they're quite difficult even in translation. So Ray has kind of made sure that people lives on Indian literature. Okay, so Tara Shankar is another Bengali author, a prolific novelist, and a very important figure in 20th century Bengali literature. Unlike Vibhuti Bhushan, he was actually very politically active in the nationalist movement. He wrote 64 novels. So, I mean, when we talk about prolific, that's very impressive. And stories and plays. He was associated with the All India Progressive Writers Association, like Premchand, but in the later period. And he was president of the Anti-Fascist Writers and Art Associations. He was more closely aligned with Marxism than Premchand was. He's known for a couple of, I mean, like I said, he wrote 64 novels. But a couple of ones that he's especially known for, The Tale of Hansuli Turn, Hansuli Banker Upakatha, and Aroginiketan, pictured here. The first novel, Hansuli, focuses on rural life. And Tara Shankar was very interested in kind of, like Premchand, representing real life people. Even more than Premchand, he was interested in representing dialect. So the language that people speak, the dialects of Bengali that people speak in the novel are very, like he studied the dialects, so they're very accurate, and they're an attempt to really capture the texture of not just everyday life, but everyday speech in India's villages. He himself was a Brahmin author, but he's always wrote about kind of subaltern characters. The novel's themes include modernization, And again, this caste critique of Gandhian kind of romanticism, which we see, of course, with Ambedkar, but we see, throughout kind of Dalit poetics, which is the critique of the critique of modernization, the idea that modernization can actually help some of India's most subaltern, and you can see the Marxism in that. Many Indian Marxists believe that actually, themes like urbanization and industrialization would actually move India into the 20th century, and especially liberate not just Dalit farmers, but sharecroppers, small farmers, Adivasis, landless laborers, all the kind of people who were like stuck in a feudal economy in the villages. So Tarashankar was definitely interested in that. He was also interested in and the Hansuli, the district where this novel takes place, is a very high has a very high Dalit and Adivasi population, very poor landless laborers, bonded laborers, and he actually was a kind of ethnographer when he wrote these texts. He went to the village and spent time with the people, and again tried to very accurately bring their life worlds into the novel. The novel has always been an elite form, of course, because it requires literacy, and so at this stage in the 1930s and 1940s, literacy rates were very low. And so you can see that the project that kind of binds a lot of these progressive writers was to use the elite novel form to actually bring in stories of non-elite people. And that became an important political project for these writers, including for Tarashankar. Tagore famously praised Tarashankar by saying, I've never read anyone who writes about rural people like you do, not standing in a distance. You'll go and sit with them and become one of them. So that was his ethnographic impulse was very central to his politics. So the next writer is T.S. Pillai, who is a Malayalam writer, and again, also a very prolific novelist and short story writer. Also, like the others that we've been discussing, wrote about the downtrodden and about social injustices. He wrote over 600 short stories. So again, when we talk about prolific, that's a lot of writing. And was also active in the progressive writers movement. So again, even when we're talking about different regions of India, different languages, you can start to see some kind of commonalities among them. One of his novels the English translation is The Scavenger's Son from 1947, and it's about a Dalit worker who tries to prevent his son from becoming a scavenger. So that important theme in Dalit writing, which we'll see when we specifically talk about Dalit writing tomorrow, but the theme of ensuring that you're of trying to break out of this cycle of you have to do exactly what your father did, of inherited professions, becomes a really important theme in Dalit writing. Pillai's most famous novel is Jameen, which is translated into English and was also adapted in a very successful film. And so this is the one everyone has heard about. Interestingly, this text is actually more of a romance than the realism that we see in Scavenger's Son, for instance. It has a fable-like quality. So it's a love story between Karuthamma and Parikutti. So she's the daughter of a poor fisherman, and he's the son of a trader. She's Hindu and he's Muslim. So they're in love, but her father, of course, arranges a marriage for her with another man, and they move to another village. Meanwhile, Parikutti goes a little bit crazy because he misses this woman so much. So he walks on the beach alone. He sings to himself. People start thinking he might be somewhat deranged. And so one day he goes to visit Garutama, the woman that he loves, in her village while her husband is out at sea, and they actually make love. And meanwhile, her husband faces a shark and a whirlpool out to sea. So he prays to his wife, which is the fisherman's guardian angel, but because she's disloyal, his prayer does not work, and he ends up dying in the sea. And in the storm, the waves are so high that Karutama and Parikutti, who are also hanging out on the beach, end up getting swept away. So you can see how it has that morality tale. If you're unfaithful, you will you will suffer tragedy. But it also has some of these, Hindu-Muslim romance. It's a cross-class romance. And then this idea of a love that is so powerful that is able to transcend all these divisions. And then there's also other themes that represent, I think, his more progressive tendency, which is like social mobility, because um, Karutama is the poorer woman, but her father, like the reason he arranges her marriage is because he wants her to be socially, he wants the family to move up socially. And so he kind of tries to improve his lot, but he does it like too much and kind of gets greedy instead. And so there's also the morality tale about like greed being corrupting to, conventional morality. So yeah, you can see how this would make a very good movie. And of course it was very popular. And again, the movie kind of made the author and um the novel last in perpetuity. The next author is U.R. Ananthamurthy, who was a Kannada writer and critic. Um, and he began his career as a professor of English at the University of Mysore, and he was president of the Sahitya Academy in 1993. He's very well known and well respected, was a very well known and well respected novelist and short story writer. And his most famous novel is Sanskar, which is the story of it's a story about caste, but through kind of through Brahmanism. So which is so it's like a critique of caste, but through Brahmin characters. So it's a story of a Brahmin man in a traditional village in Karnataka who has flouted all the rules of Brahmanism his whole life. So he like eats meat, drinks alcohol, he marries someone from another caste, he mocks God, he's not very religious at all. But then what happens in the first few pages of the novel is that this man, this disrespectful Brahmin, dies unexpectedly. And the rest of the village Brahmins have to discuss what happens to him, because he wasn't really a Brahmin. So do they do the traditional Brahmin funeral rites for him, or do they not, because he had broken all these rules? The Brahmins don't know what to do. They consult with each other, they consult with the village elders, and no one really has an answer. But meanwhile, the body is sitting there like rotting, the body of this man. So then the novel is through this kind of interesting, simple plot twist. The novel traces various characters as they try to think about what should be done with this man. And what it does is obviously expose that like there's a lot of hypocrisy among kind of the Brahmin community. Um, so um, so like there's Pranesh Acharya, who is another fellow Brahmin, who's like also kind of finding himself having lustful thoughts for women, lower caste women. There's Chandri, who's the mistress of the dead man. And there are all these characters who are kind of trying to negotiate this like tricky terrain. And the novel, so as you can see, it's a critique of kind of Brahmin hypocrisy, because everyone is like breaking laws all the time. But when it comes to ritual purity, people like draw this hard line as if they're the more pure than everyone else around them. And it's a critique of kind of the misguided ways people look for salvation in the wrong places. Um, Ananthamurthy has been outspoken in his criticism of Hindu nationalism in general, like as it rose in India over the last several decades. But the novel is really more a more subtle critique of. It's not so much a critique of Hinduism at all. It's just a critique of um, like a group of men who try to proclaim themselves superhuman, like better than everyone else around them, more pure, more moral than everyone around them, and their obsession with like asceticism, purity, and rituals, to the point where they kind of lose their humanity a bit. And it was a very successful novel. It's been translated into many languages, and very influential in India and beyond. So I want to talk. Oh yeah, this is the information on sanskar. So I wanted to talk about one more author who is Isma Chugtai, but I think what we'll do for time is we'll actually have some questions now, and then I will begin the next session talking about Isma Chugtai because I think I don't want to just rush through it. So yeah. So yeah, questions or anything
Yeah.
about.
Yeah, thank you so much, ma'am, for your insightful session about how different bhasas or the languages reflect reality of society through the literary text. So now we will take up questions. So the first question is from Aparna. She asked, how could a writer write with the global essence as he or she is from a particular place, and therefore it's obvious that the culture, tradition, and language would reflect as an involuntary action?
Yeah, that's a really important question. Thank you for asking it. It also raises this question of what we mean when we talk about global literature. Like, I think you're pointing out, like, if global literature has to not have any culture, if it's like non-cultural or super cultural, then is it even worth reading or anything? And so I think that's a good question. I think what I would hope is that, books can get globally recognized without losing their culture. I personally, some of the books that I most enjoy reading are from places where I don't have personal experience there, but somehow there's something human or there's a good story or something that captures me and I'm able to transcend that cultural difference. But so I think that's the ideal, is that you would read something that is embedded in its culture and still find it interesting even though it doesn't relate to you. And I'm sure you've had experiences, everyone, of like reading a book from Africa or reading a book from Mexico or something and finding like a deep connection with it even though you don't know anything about the place. So that's what I would hope. But I think you're right though, and the critique that has been made of this idea of global literature is exactly what you said, Aparna, which is that it has to deculturate itself in order to appeal to a global audience. And in doing so, it loses what makes it good in the first place. And so many people have said that about African writers who are world famous or Indian writers who are world famous. A lot of people have said that about someone like Rushdie, where you've made it kind of global, and so you've taken out all of the culture from it. But the second thing I'll say to this good question is that we should also reconsider what we mean by global. There is a tendency to think that if something's successful globally, it means it's successful in the US or the UK. But what about like other kinds of interactions? So like Pakistani literature is published mostly in India. Indian literature is very popular in Pakistan. So why don't we think about those kinds of connections, even just, and that's, to me, that's a success of a global, as everyone knows, Korean dramas are very popular in India, and that has nothing to do with the West, the US or the UK. So it is interesting to think about other forms of global connections. I mean, Korean dramas are a really good example of something where they're very popular in India, even though they are in Korean and embedded in Korean culture, but they're very popular in India. And I think that's a really good example of like, we can think about connections where you don't have to lose the place for it to have a global resonance.
Yeah, thank you so much, ma'am. There's no other question now. Uh, so we can take a little break, and after that we can continue with another session.
May I interrupt you, Saloni? There is one more question, and maybe it's not visible to you. So maybe I can just read it out for you, ma'am. What are the major themes of 20th century Bhasha writing?
So again, there's like a huge diverse body of literature. So we can't completely homogenize, but some of the things I mentioned, realism and attention to the humanity of people of all classes and castes, an attempt to represent an attempt to make literature relevant to social concern. So to make literature not something that is about escapism, but is about the real lives of people. And like we're talking about this period of nationalism where the leaders, many of the nationalist leaders, as you know, including Gandhi, including Nehru, including Jinnah, all had their education abroad. They didn't know much about the real India. And so writers had different relationships. Some of the writers, Premchand was completely of his village. Tagore had a lot of experience abroad, as did Mulk-Raj Anand. So there was a huge range in terms of writers, but I think what writers felt is that if they could bring some of the reality of Indian life to literature and spread it among the elite, then it would give people who are leading India into independence some idea of what India really was. So I think that was probably a main theme. Now I do want to talk about Isma Chugtai after the break, and she's moved a little bit away from this main theme. So for every rule there's an exception, but I would say that's a dominant theme of this period.
Okay. Yes, so I believe there are no more questions, so we can go for a break of 5 minutes. Thank you.
Hello everyone, welcome you all for the second session of today's GIAN course. Over to you, ma'am. The session is yours.
Okay, can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, ma'am. It's
Okay.
visible.
Okay, great. So yeah, so we're gonna move on to the next topic in a second, but I did want to have the chance. Well, first of all, we talked about no women writers in that first section, so I want to make sure that we don't exclude women writers from the 20th century Pasha writing. And also, I want to point out that Isma Chugdai is she's an interesting case because she is kind of moved away from some of the dominant trends that we saw in the last discussion among 20th century Pasha writers. So I'll tell you a little bit about her. So she was also a member of the, let's see if I can, yeah, she's also a member of the Progressive Writers Association. She was an Urdu writer of many short stories and novels. But what's interesting about her is she was a member of the Progressive Writers Association. She was politically committed to Marxism, progressivism, realism, but she didn't like some of the strictures of progressive writing. She felt like this idea that you had to write about the subaltern, or you had to write about the oppressed and the downtrodden, she found constraining as a writer. So even though she was politically completely supportive. So I think she's a very interesting figure to also just see some of the limitations of a project of progressive writing that tells writers what is the appropriate thing to write about. And if you don't write about that, then you're no longer count as a progressive writer. That kind of stricture, which of course we see in Marxism across the world. Of course, we see what happens in the Soviet Union, where the idea of Marxism actually becomes kind of so rigid that it stops being a freeing enterprise and actually becomes a repressive one. So I just want to talk a little bit about Chughtai's novel, Tehri Lakir, the crooked, translated as the Crooked Line. Um, and this is just, it's one of my favorite novels of of definitely of the 20th century Pasha writing. I mean, so originally written in Urdu, and it's a novel about a girl named Shamman. And she just is like a strange child who just can't fit into anything in the world around her. And the novel is not autobiographical, although when you do read about Chughtai's life, you do realize that she has some things in common with Shaman. And what those things are is just an inability to do what everyone tells her to do. Now, we're talking about 1943, a girl who grows up in a pretty traditional Muslim family where there is, segregation, and where marriage is basically the only thing that girls are trained for. For Isma Chugsa, who grew up in that, she grew up in that kind of family, but she was encouraged to educate herself by her family. But in the novel, but I mean, still thinking about writing in a very traditional sphere, writing stories of a really rebellious young girl, it's pretty before its time. Like it's kind of very it feels very contemporary, even though it was written in 1943. So I'll just give you an example of some of the delightful things that this novel does. This is the first page of the novel, and you'll get a sense of what it does. To begin with, her birth was ill-timed. Bariappa, whose friend Salma was to be married soon, was working briskly on a crepe dupatta, stitching gold lace to its borders. Amma, who regarded herself as a youthful maiden, despite the fact that she had given birth to so many children, was scrubbing off dead skin from her heels with a pumice stone. Suddenly, dark clouds rolled in, and in the ensuing commotion, the long-standing desire to send for an English midwife came to naught, and she appeared. The minute she arrived into the world, she let out such a thunderous howl, God help us. Another edition after 9 children. Why, it was as if the hands on the clock had moved to 10. Who had time for weddings now? Orders were to heat water for the baby sister's bath, and shedding tears that were steamier than boiling water, and cursing at the same time. Bariappa put water on the stove to boil. And as if to mock her, some of the scalding water spilled over from the pot and seared her hand. May God curse this baby sister. Why won't Amma's womb close up now? That was the limit. A sister, a brother, then another sister and brother. It seemed that beggars had found a way to their house, and now there was no keeping them out. Were there not enough mouths already? Why all these newcomers? Coming in like cats and dogs, ever hungry, they had depleted the grain reserves. Milk had become scarce, even though there were 2 cows in the house, and still the bellies of these newcomers remained empty. Um, and then she continues, this was all Abba's fault. Amma was never given the opportunity to breastfeed her children. As soon as a baby arrived, the wet nurse from Agra was sent for to nurse the infant and sit next to Amma's bed all day. The house was more like an animal shed than a house. Why, food was always prepared in excessively large quantities. And as for drink, gallons of that too. And if you wanted to sleep, you would find every corner of the house deluged with life, ready to teem over. It's such a great beginning to a novel because it upturns all of these stereotypes and expectations you would have about this traditional, like, large Muslim family. It starts with, an ill-timed birth is the first line, which is, superstitious, and like she's already, the narrator's kind of upturning all of these expectations about birth being propitious. Um, the whole thing is like the way that the birth of the sister is described as like this calamity that has befallen the family. And it's funny, and she compares having kids to animals. There's a social critique message, of course, which is, that people are having too many children, which is there is a political issue there as well, children that they can't take care of. But and Chukdai herself did live in a family of, I think, 10 brothers and sisters. But in this novel, it's less political, that it's about this young girl who just finds the whole process of marriage and reproduction kind of revolting. And actually, what's so interesting about this novel is that Chukdai had no language to talk about kind of queer sexuality when she's writing this in 1943. But in all her writings, she's very interested in people who don't quite fit in, especially they don't fit in models of, like, especially girls who don't fit in ideas of what it means to be a good girl, which is to get married and have children. So many of her writings are about kind of the revulsion that she and her characters feel around this whole process of marriage and reproduction. Now, in the light of what we know now about what queer female sexuality looks like, we can actually look back and say that this was a kind of proto queerness, even though it was not articulated um, in any explicit way. And this is definitely borne out in the story of Shamin in this novel. She's a strange child. She not only hates other children and thinks her mother is like a reproducing animal, but she gets like obsessed with certain other mother figures in her life, and almost like a kind of sexual obsession. So first, as a young child, she gets obsessed with her wet nurse. And when the wet nurse her boyfriend comes, she gets very jealous. So there's like a libidinal, erotic kind of relationship she has with all of these different mother figures. So first it's a wet nurse, then her sister takes care of her for a while. She gets obsessed with her sister, falls around, like wants to, and then same thing is when the sister gets married, she feels very jealous. When she goes to school, she goes to boarding school, she kind of falls in love with she gets obsessed with her friends, various girls at school. And then and like it becomes a kind of a feature of her personality where she just like falls in love with, I mean, again, it's not mentioned as love, it's mentioned as obsession with all of these different women. So again, like there's no vocabulary to talk about like same-sex desire in 1943 in Urdu, but it's like all over the text. And I think this is something, again, not just this text, but all of Chughtai's text. You might actually know her most for her story Lihaf, the quilt, which she wrote in 1942, which is a excuse me, which is a very famous story now. It's on many syllabi. So the story is about a girl who is too much of a tomboy at her house. She um, plays with boys and she doesn't know what it's like to be a good girl. So to punish her, excuse me, to punish her and to have and to train her. Her mother sends her to a older relative's house where she's supposed to stay and get proper training on what it means to be a good girl. But irony of all irony, she gets to this older couple's house and she finds that they don't live together at all. The husband is constantly inviting young, good-looking men to his house and showering them with gifts and paying attention to them and completely ignoring his wife, who lives in the Zenana, in the women's quarters. And she lives there, she's stuck there. He never comes to her. And so she kind of is like stuck there without any way to gratify her own kind of sexual or emotional pleasure. So that's how the story starts, and it's already many things queer about it. The non-gender conforming protagonist, and then the house she comes into in which the man is following his queer pursuits, and the woman is following the woman is left to her own. So because she's Begum John is the woman's name. Begum John is left to her own inside the Zenana. She is very intimately close with one of the servants, Rabbo, and Rabbo starts to care for her, like starts to care for her physically. So the narrator is this young girl who is sent to this house to learn what it's like to learn how to be a good woman. She's sleeping in the same room as Begum John, and at night she hears these strange noises between Begum John and the maidservant, Rubbo. So this is one quote. So she says, "At night I woke up with a start," this is the narrator. "It was pitch dark. Begum John's quilt was shaking vigorously as if an elephant was struggling beneath it. Begum John, my voice was barely audible. The elephant subsided. What is it? Go to sleep." Begum John's voice seemed to come from afar. The next night when I woke up, a quarrel between Begum John and Rubbo was being settled on the bed itself. I could not make out what conclusion was reached, but I heard Rubbo sobbing. Then there were sounds of a cat slobbering in the saucer. Okay, so you can read this as a young girl, and her imagination, her misunderstanding of what's going on. But if you read it through what we know is happening, which is that Begum John and Rubbo are having sex. But the way that remember the story is called Lihaf, the quilt. So the way the narrator sees it, because she's a young girl, she doesn't understand what's happening. She sees that the quilt was shaking vigorously. Okay, so the Lihaf becomes the kind of protagonist in the story for a young girl who doesn't know what's happening. And then the quarrel is also her misreading of sex, a quarrel that is being settled on the bed. Rubbo sobbing, and then the cat slobbering in a saucer implies, the sexual act. So, and the whole story it's a very short story, but it goes on like this, like the girl's kind of horror at what she hears and is experiencing, but also her fascination with it. So it was a very controversial story when it came out in 1942, as you can imagine. It was considered obscene by the Indian government, and Isma Chugtai was taken to court, and the story was called obscene, and her lawyer had to defend it. And the interesting thing about the defense is that the lawyer, the whole story is written like this from the perspective of a girl who doesn't understand what's going on. So the defense of the lawyer to the court was, find me one obscene word in this whole story. And the judge could not find an obscene word because quilt and quarrel and sobbing and slobbering are not obscene words. They're there because the narrator doesn't know what was actually happening, but none of the words are actually obscene. And so by a strange trick, the story of a girl who didn't understand the sex that was happening around her actually was a defense for the story not being obscene, and she was acquitted for obscenity. Since then, it became a very famous story, obviously because of its clear queer themes. And also interesting, like this is the Zenana, so this is often seen as a space of women's oppression. So one of the things Chugtai does is like re-sexualize, re-eroticize the Zenana. And so, very much disputing stereotypes of the Zenana and of Muslim kind of women's oppression within it. So the story's become very famous. It's taught all the time. Chukdai herself, because she only passed away in 1991, so she knew about the fame of the story. She didn't love it. She was just like, it's one story I wrote, and I wrote a lot of other stories too. She didn't, she said publicly, like, I didn't know anything about what a lesbian was. I didn't know anything. All I knew was what I had experienced. So I wasn't writing about this as a queer story. But obviously she was writing about queer experiences that were happening in the spaces of the home that that a child, again, wouldn't necessarily know how to name. So I mentioned this. I mentioned this. I hope you can see why I wanted to include Chukdai on this list, not only as a woman writer, as a Muslim woman writer, as an Urdu writer, but also as someone who was a little bit out of sync with like what was happening in the world of kind of male Marxist realists. She's much more interested in the strange and the erotic, and those were not necessarily topics that were being discussed or that people were comfortable talking about. Some of the men, and it was not only her, she was very good friends with Sadat Hassan Manto, who some of you, I'm sure you've heard about, the author of Toba Texting and many, many other wonderful stories. Both Chukdai and Manto were friends. They both worked in the film industry in Bombay. Manto's family went to Pakistan. Chukdai's did not. But both Manto and her were a little bit outside of the mainstream of the progressive writers because they wrote about sexuality and the erotic. And I think there's also a larger conversation to have about why sex isn't considered political. It wasn't considered political enough because it felt too indulgent and too I don't know, individualistic. So when we talk about queer writing tomorrow, we will come back to some of these themes, but I wanted to make sure that we covered them in the 20th century Pasha writing too, so you wouldn't think that queer themes only emerge in the 21st century, which they don't. Okay, so I'm going to now share next. Okay, is this PowerPoint visible?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am,
it's
it is
visible.
visible.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, so this next lecture is on similar themes, the question of language, Bahasha versus English, and it thinks about how conversations around language have affected the Indian literary space in the 1990s till today. Yeah, this covers some of the themes that we've been thinking about and brings up some new ones too. And it'll be a good bridge to the third lecture of the day, which is on contemporary Hindi writing. So everyone knows that English was brought to India by colonialism, and it still remains an elite language, which with currently only around 20% of the population being English speaking. So it's still an elite language, and that 20% largely coincides with class. Of course, regionally it's different. In the Northeast and the South and in Goa, there are more English speakers, but generally class is a good indication of whether someone will speak English. But on the other hand, English is a global language, so it does have global reach, and English publishing is still where the money is. Increasingly, that center of that publishing is shifting to India. So it used to be in the days of Rushdie that you had to get published in the UK or the US first, and then you could get published in India second. That really has changed. So when Rushdie wrote Midnight's Children, he got it published in the UK first. That really has changed. Indian English publishing in India is the third largest in the world and is growing at such a rate that it might actually take over the US and the UK, English language publishing in India. So anyone in South Asia, Sri Lankan writers, Bangladeshi writers, Nepali writers, Pakistani writers go to India to publish their books. So Indian publishing is huge in the huge growth industry, but in English still is where the profits are, not in the Bhashas. So that's something to consider. So some of the questions I want to ask, and these are questions that we have asked all week, we'll continue to ask as we go on. And I mentioned this earlier, is English an Indian language? Is English a bhasha? Can an Indian writer truly express an Indian life world in English? Because English is elite, does all writing in English necessarily reflect an elite worldview? Is writing in English always directed at an international audience rather than an Indian one? Does writing in English privilege diasporic writers? Because English is more lucrative, are writers pressured to write in English rather than their own bhashas? In other words, does the market affect the language that people choose to write in? And what does it mean that so much Indian literature is in the language of the colonizers? Not all of it, of course, but so much of it. So these are questions I don't have an answer to these questions. I think there's good answers. There's a yes and no argument for each of these questions. And so I don't think, I think there's a good argument that English is an Indian language, and there's a good argument that English is not an Indian language, and so on and so forth. So I don't think these questions have clear-cut answers, but I think they're good ways to kind of structure thinking about this debate. So the 1990s was the era when kind of we really saw, I mean, we have Midnight's Children published in 1981, but it was really the 1990s when Indian literature started getting global fame. And as I answered to the last question in the last session, global fame tends to mean fame in the United States, which is not right. It shouldn't mean that, but that's what it means. So the United States started to pay attention to Indian literature in the 1990s, and you can see that from this cover of the New Yorker magazine from 1997, in which you literally have Americans discovering Indian literature. Like they're like Indiana Jones type Americans who push aside some trees and discover Indian fiction. So I think the article, the image, excuse me, the image is a critique of that discovery narrative, but it's like in classic New Yorker fashion. It's a critique of the discovery narrative, but also completely perpetuating the discovery narrative because, in fact, the article is about is the discovery of Indian literature. Note that June 23rd, 1997 is just after the publication of The God of Small Things, and that was like instantly a bestseller. And so that was, I think, what prompted this special issue. Inside of this magazine was a feature of 11 authors, all of whom wrote in English. We have Vikram Chandra, Rohinton Mistry, Arundhati Roy, Salman Rushdie, Anita Desai, Amit Chaudhary, Kiran Desai, Adarsha Vakil, Vikram Seth, Amitav Ghosh, and Ramesh Gunasekara, who is Sri Lankan. So all of these writers are English language writers. And so it's important to note that the discovery of Indian literature is really a discovery of Indian literature in English. And that conflation made and continues to make bhasha writers feel like, ironically, they're the ones who don't count as Indian writers, even though, as we mentioned earlier, there's like, it's people writing in English who might be seen as less Indian, but because Indian literature is being discovered and this is what counts as Indian literature, it made bhasha writers feel like their literature didn't matter because it wasn't in English. And so this was like 1997, and then we start to see kind of more conversation in the public sphere in India, especially around these questions. What counts as Indian literature? What makes, what does it mean to write for a global audience versus a local audience? All these questions that we've been asking. So literary critic Meenakshi Mukherjee, who's pictured here, who passed away, but she was a well-known scholar of Indian writing in English. And she went to a talk by Vikram Chandra, who's also pictured here, who's the author of many books, including Love and Longing in Bombay. So she goes to a talk by him, and she asked him the questions, basically criticized him for using in his book chapter titles like Dharma, Shakti, Kama, Arth, and Shanti. She said something like, you're using abstract Sanskrit words to signify Indianness to your like American readership. These words that like you're just kind of using it to authenticate yourself in using these Sanskrit words. So it was a criticism of him. And this seems to have come out of an earlier earlier article she wrote in 1993 in EPW called The Anxiety of Indianness. And in that, she tried to explain why English novels written by Indians have suddenly gained more visibility than ever before in the brief span of our relationship with the English language. So she's saying, okay, Indians have always written in English. We just discussed all the, yesterday we discussed all the English writing, but now they're getting all this attention. Why is that the case? And she says that part of the reason for that is in the English texts of India, there may be a greater pull towards a homogenization of reality and essentializing of India, a certain flattening out of the complicated and conflicting contours, the ambiguous and shifting relations that exist between individuals and groups in a plural community. So in short, what she's saying is that there's the English texts sometimes write about India as if it's a whole thing, whereas Bhasha texts sometimes write about a region, and they don't try to make grand statements about India itself. And that there's a little more like, because you're trying to explain India to kind of Western readers, you just take a few more liberties with how much you generalize. Okay, so this is what she said right at this moment when everyone is paying attention to all of these English writers. And then she added to that this critique: what in progressive American universities is now called colonial discourse theory privileges colonialism as the framework for the major cultural experience of the century, and it is these academics now that set the terms for critical debates and creative enterprise in the world. Yet we know that in very few of the major works of fiction in the Indian languages is colonialism any longer an important concern. Far more pervasive has been, for example, the theme of partition, and the writers in at least 4 languages of the country, Hindi, Urdu, Bengali, and Punjabi, have gone back again and again to this rupture to understand our present. Many other forms of internal dissension, dislocation, and oppression engage the attention of the Pasha writer today, relegating the trauma of colonial experience to the background. So this is an important critique, and it goes back to some of the stuff we were talking about on the first day, which is that the 1990s was not only the rise of the discovery of the Indian novel in the United States, but it was also the rise of post-colonial theory as a discipline in English departments in American universities. And the rise of that made the study of colonialism like the center point around which to study the rest of the world. So what Mukherjee is pointing out here is that the whole idea of colonialism as the key formative moment for India is already a kind of Western idea. And remember, we talked about this on Monday, that that colonialism, like the study of Orientalism, the study of colonial thought, still ended up being like really the study of the West. It's not really enough the study of India. So it's like the study of, it's like decolonizing Indian literature that had been colonized, but the attention, the effort and the attention was still on the decolonizing part of it rather than on the Indian part of it. So I think this is just what Mukherjee is saying here. She's just saying like, that what takes place in US university contexts shouldn't necessarily always dictate what counts as literature in India. And I think that's a very valid critique. But it was not taken as a valid critique by other writers, including Vikram Chandra, who got very, very offended by this. And he wrote this like tirade in the Boston Review, which he titled "The Cult of Authenticity." And he basically said, like, why are Indian critics so obsessed with authenticity? As he thought about this evening, as I thought about this evening, as the months passed, I noticed the constant hum of this rhetoric. He's referring to the evening where Meenakshi Mukherjee calls him out for his book titles. This anxiety about the anxiety of Indianness, this notion of a real reality that was being distorted by third world cosmopolitans, this fear of an all devouring and all distorting West. I heard it in conversations, in critical texts, and reviews. And Indians who wrote in English were one of the prime locations for this rhetoric to test itself, to make its declarations of power and belonging, to announce its possession of certain territories, and its right to delineate lines of control. A friend told me about a meeting of the Delhi University Syllabus Revision Committee where they were trying to decide on the one Indo-Anglian novel that should be prescribed in the one course on modern Indian literature. My friend suggested Midnight's Children, and she was shouted down. Salman Rushdie is an Indian, the majority of the professors asserted. Amitav Ghosh, however, was found to be sufficiently Indian, and so his Shadow Lines was accepted into the canon. The issue was decided not on the basis of the relative merits of the books, but on the perceived Indianness of the authors, and by implication, the degree of their assimilation by the West. So I call this a tirade because it is very, it's like very disingenuous in terms of how he understands Mukherjee's critique. He is saying that like it's all about our authenticity when I think her point was much more subtle. Her point was much more nuanced. It was that the location you are affects like how you understand the reality you're trying to write about. And as a diasporic writer, you should understand that you're looking at India through the lens of India because you're apart from it. When you're sitting in in rural Karnataka and writing about what the world around you, your perspective is embedded in that place. And I think that's a fair observation. But he takes it as like this real questioning of his authenticity, and again, a kind of attack on Mukherjee and the subtlety that she was trying to bring to it, and a kind of defense of English. So I think that this conversation is important because it kind of again it raises questions about what counts as Indian writing. The debate that this brought up kind of just was like a debate between the global and the local, between inauthentic and authentic, English and Bhashas, outside and inside. But and so the debate itself was kind of unproductive because both sides just felt like the other was not being intelligent or fair. But my perspective is that it is important to look at the power structures that sustain what gets to be prominent and what not. I mean, whether the fact is that what happens in U.S. universities um, is what is like privilege over what happens in other universities. So if post-colonial theory gets into US universities, then it starts trickling back to India and other universities. It shouldn't be that way, but it is because the power and the money and the resources are all in the US universities. And so it is important to realize that that is going to affect and change how people write. And if you're looking for a Western audience, then you might change how you write. So I think that should be acknowledged, and Chandra does not acknowledge. But obviously, Chandra's right in the sense of like your identity shouldn't totally determine what your literature is. People should read the literature. So his criticism here is that people weren't actually reading Midnight's Children and saying one does it offer. They were just looking at the identity of the author, and I think that's also a mistake. So I think he's right there. In the case of the Delhi University context. But I also think that and then also questions, I mean, none of this addresses questions of gender, questions of caste, questions of religion, what counts as an Indian writer, but like, what if you're a Dalit writer or a Muslim writer or a female writer? That also adds perspective. And so that you can't it's not just about what nationality you belong to. There's other intersectional identities that affect how you write. So, a few ways I think of getting out of this impasse. One of the things is this discussion we had yesterday about new Englishes. And I'm thinking of when we talked about kind of Pulp Fiction and Chetan Bhagat, I'm thinking about whether this might help get out of this binaristic thinking between global and local, inauthentic and authentic, English bhashas, inside, outside. So we talked about Bhagat, Johan, and Tripathi writing in this simpler English. And I'm wondering whether like a simpler English that is less elite might actually uh, like solve the problem that they're talking about, because for Mukherjee, the problem is kind of the elitism, but seeing English as a bhasha, does that change that perspective? Also, we talked about accented English and Hinglish, and there's ways to think about different ways that English is actually used, and by many people that take it out of that sense of being inauthentic. So I'm thinking about Hinglish. I mean, I've seen these film posters. This Hinglish is everywhere. I mean, Dil Mange More, Jab We Met, and we always see this in Bollywood titles, but you see it in advertisements. And you see it on television, just the language, the Hinglish that is like fully comprehensible to most people in India, but not, it's kind of a mix. So does this kind of English or Hinglish, does that maybe complicate this binaristic thinking? Also, one thing that hasn't been fully discussed, but I think would be great to research, is the use of English on WhatsApp, in a way that not just sometimes people text in English, but also use Roman script to write Devanagari. I'm sorry, Roman script to write Hindi on WhatsApp. So these are kind of new languages that are forming that complicate this idea that English is only a foreign language. I mentioned yesterday that Chetan Bhagat's books are translated into Indian languages, but it's interesting how they're translated. This is worth seeing. This is Two States in Hindi, and as you can see, the title is Two States, Meri Shadi Ki Kahani. So the Meri Shadi Ki Kahani is the translation of the story of my marriage, but Two States, those states, is actually left in the English rather than Do Pradesh. Like they could have translated it and they didn't. And this is not just true of this. This is a Gujarati translation of Half Girlfriend. And as you can see from the title is Half Girlfriend, written, it's in the English words Half Girlfriend, written in Gujarati script. And so we see a similar thing with the Three Mistakes of My Life, which is here in Bangla. Just transliterated, Three Mistakes of My Life, transliterated into Bangla script. And so I guess what I'm trying to point out is that what is English and what is Bhashas here? This is a translation into Bangla of a novel that was in English, but the Bangla translation is also partly in English. And obviously the text is going to be in Bangla, but it's kind of interesting how these lines, these rigid lines we have between languages, are kind of being blurred. I think they're being blurred in Bollywood titles, in Bollywood films. They're being blurred in advertisements. They're being blurred in translations of Chetan Bhagat, and they're being blurred on WhatsApp, where people are just writing in a multiplicity of languages that doesn't fit into this kind of inauthenticity debate. Also, another thing is that Hindi itself has contemporary Hindi literature by Hindi writers, originally written in Hindi, uses a lot of English words, and that's pretty common even in literary prose. So I'm going to talk about this novel in the next session, but this is Nakohas, which is a 2016 literary novel by Purushottam Agarwal, and you can just see that I've highlighted here. This is like from one page of the novel, but I've highlighted all the words that are English words. So you have model, dinosaur, start, traffic, fast traffic, mobile, dinosaur again, rubber bands, packet, and mobile, just like in one paragraph. This is just like a random paragraph I chose. You can see how much English is in it. And of course there is, because this is how people speak. No one's translating mobile or traffic into Hindi when they're using it. So I think and this is something we'll get into in the next session. So I think these are important points about kind of the contemporary life of these languages. I'm just using Hindi here as an example, but this is true across many languages. The contemporary life of languages really does not allow us to have a simplistic idea of English versus Pashas. There's also a historical point that I want to remind people of when we go back to the 19th century, which is that the modern languages that we now use, what we consider modern Tamil, Odia, Bangla, Kannada, all the languages that we now use, that we consider, were all actually born in the colonial period. Because what happened is that the languages that existed before the colonial period were like, they have longer histories, of course, but they were often poetic. They often didn't have a lot of terms to discuss kind of modern concepts. And they were actually modernized by colonial reformers and Indians who were educated by colonial reformers who wanted to make the languages modern enough to be used in modern society. And so just to give a couple of examples, Urdu, for example, was modernized in the 19th century by Indians like Muhammad Hussein Azad, who was a very important poet, but also realized that the Urdu that he had at his disposal was not an Urdu that you could talk about contemporary issues in. It was full of, especially Urdu was full of very poetic language, very erudite language taken from Persian, that was very full of imagination. But if you've heard a ghazal or a Hindi or Urdu love song, that like the language is very poetic and but in poetry especially very obscure, and some of those links with Persian make it very difficult for people sometimes to understand, including Urdu speakers, because it's so elevated. So one of the things Muhammad Hussein Azad did, he was not the only one. There was a whole generation of reformers who basically said, okay, let's fix Urdu. So part of that meant taking out some of the extra words and the extra flourishes. But it also meant adding words, like the word for nature. There was no word in Urdu for nature before the 19th century because nature itself is a modern concept. And so kind of by inventing these words, reformers actually made Urdu into a language right now where you can have a biology textbook in Urdu that explains science. You can have a nature book in Urdu that explains nature. You couldn't necessarily have that before. And Urdu is just one example. Same thing happened in Tamil, where like Tamil, the strong tradition was poetry. And people realize, if we want to, I mean, this is the 19th century, so suddenly there are like lots of topics that people are talking about, like caste, the position of women, child marriage, abolition of sati, nationalism. These are all like conversations happening in the public sphere, but the language was so poetic that it was like almost you couldn't actually write about, pro and con position of women, widow remarriage, pro and con widow remarriage. These are some of the issues people were discussing in the late 19th century in India. Indians were discussing, should widows be allowed to remarry? So you take a debate, you have a debate on that. One person, says, no, they shouldn't. That's not part of our tradition. Someone else says the modern day, but you don't have the language to have that if you only have a poetic language. So literally Tamil, like all the other languages, had to be modernized to produce a language that could discuss modern topics. So the reason I point this out is because, and by the way, if they hadn't done this modernization of the languages, then English would have been the only language to discuss these things. So actually the modernizing of Urdu, the modernizing of Tamil, the modernizing of Odia, all this made sure that those languages survive until today. And the reason that we have such rich language is the reason we have newspapers, and every debate in every language on television and in writing can take place in all of India's bhashas because they went through this process in the 19th century. So the reason I'm pointing this out is because this authenticity debate between English and the bhashas a little bit assumes that the bhashas have been in the same form for millennia and English is a new language. But what I'm trying to point out is that all our languages are new languages. All the bhashas are new, or they've been reformed. I mean, they have ancient histories, no doubt about it, but the versions that we use are very much modern. They were founded in the modern times in the 19th century. And so that I think is an important corrective to some of this authenticity debate, because I think we forget that, if one were to speak authentic classical Tamil, one would not be able to speak about modern concepts. So that I think is an important historical point. So there's the historical point, and then there's the point about the languages in the present. And then I just want to end by talking about similar debates that took place in the African context, because it's important to realize that these authenticity debates and the debates about the question of English are not restricted only to South Asia. So one debate that was took place in the 60s between Chinua Achebe, a Nigerian writer, Chinua Achebe, and Kenyan writer Ngugi wa Thiong'o, I think was very similar to the discussions that we see in the Indian context. So at a conference on African writing in 1962, Achebe gave a talk that basically said that African writers should reclaim English, because English just, like, despite colonialism, English plays an important role in allowing people to speak to each other across languages. And Ngugi was very powerfully opposed to that idea, saying that African literature has to be written in an African language. And Ngugi, Achebe wrote his whole life in English. Ngugi wrote his early novels in English, but then switched entirely to Gikuyu, which is his native language. So I want to give you a sense of that debate a little bit. Here's what Achebe says. I've indicated somewhat offhandedly that the national literature of Nigeria and of many other countries of Africa is or will be written in English. This may sound like a controversial statement, but it isn't. All I have done has been to look at the reality of present-day Africa. This reality may change as a result of deliberate, i.e., political action. If it does, an entirely new situation will arise, and there will be plenty of time to examine it. At present, it may be more profitable to look at the scene as it is. What are the factors which have conspired to place English in the position of national language in many parts of Africa? Quite simply, the reason is that these nations were created in the first place by the intervention of the British, which, I hasten to add, is not saying that the peoples comprising these nations were invented by the British. The country which we know as Nigeria today began not so very long as the arbitrary creation of the British. It is true, as William Fagg says, that this arbitrary action has proved as lucky in terms of African art history as any enterprise of the fortunate Princess of Serendip, and I believe that in political and economic terms too, this arbitrary creation called Nigeria holds out wonderful prospects. Yet the fact remains that Nigeria was created by the British for their own ends. Let us give the devil his due. Colonialism in Africa disrupted many things, but it did create big political units where there were small, scattered ones before. Nigeria had hundreds of autonomous communities ranging in size from the vast Fulani Empire, founded by Usman Dan Fodio in the north, to tiny village entities in the east. Today it is one country. Of course, there are areas of Africa where colonialism divided a single ethnic group among 2 or even 3 powers, but on the whole, it did bring together many peoples that had hitherto gone their several ways, and it gave them a language with which to talk to one another. If it failed to give them a song, it at least gave them a tongue for sighing. There are not many countries in Africa today where you could abolish the language of the erstwhile colonial powers and still retain the facility for mutual communication. Therefore, those African writers who have chosen to write in English or French are not unpatriotic smart Alecs with an eye on the main chance outside their own countries. They are byproducts of the same processes that made the new nation states of Africa. So you can see here that Achebe takes a somewhat pragmatic stance, saying that, colonialism stinks, but colonialism gave us English. And I will mention an interesting statistic. I remember I said earlier that 20% of India speaks English. I also found that 80% of Nigeria speaks English today. So actually, the penetration of English in Nigeria is actually much more significant than in India, which I thought was interesting. And so, yeah, so he said, let's not criticize African writers who want to write in English. They're not doing it just to get a global audience or to make more money. They're doing it because they are a product of, these colonial processes. And that's something that writers like Amitav Ghosh have talked about too. Amitav Ghosh has said he can't write a novel in any other language but English. Like, it's not that he's like choosing between Bengali and English or Hindi and English. He's like, I can't, the only language I have is English. And that is a product of colonial education. The fact that for a few Indians, not all and not many, but for a certain class of Indians, English is their native language. It is their mother tongue, even though they're multilingual. So, Ngugi's point really comes from something deeper, and the longer essay is worth reading. This is only excerpts. Ngugi says, the choice of language and the use to which language is put is central to a people's definition of themselves. I was born into a large peasant family, father of 4 wives and about 28 children. I also belonged, as we all did in those days, to a wider extended family and to the community as a whole. We spoke Gikuyu as we worked in the fields. We spoke Gikuyu in and outside the home. The home and the field were then our pre-primary school, the language of our evening teach-ins and the language of our immediate and wider community and the language of our work in the fields were one. And then I went to school, a colonial school, and this harmony was broken. The language of my education was no longer the education of my culture. In 1952, English became the language of my formal education. In Kenya, English became more than a language, it was the language, and all the others had to bow before it in deference. One of the most humiliating experiences was to be caught speaking Gikuyu in the vicinity of the school. The attitude to English was the exact opposite. Any achievement in spoken or written English was highly rewarded. English became the measure of intelligence and ability in the arts, the sciences, and all the other branches of learning. English was the official vehicle and the magic formula to colonial elitedom. Thus, language and literature were taking us further and further from ourselves to other selves, from our world to other worlds. So, Ngugi's point, I think, is much more, well, it's a deeper point than Achebe's, and I think it's a deeper point than Chandra's to Vikram Chandra in the earlier. Tiongo's saying, like, the question of language isn't just about what languages we have at our disposal, and it's not about the politics of authenticity. It's that colonialism was a violent, forced people to violently hate their own selves and their own tongues. And in that violent break, made people lose something of themselves. And so writing in English, then you're just writing, um, you're like accepting that loss rather than refusing it. And so I think that's a, it's an interesting perspective, but and then, like I said, Ngugi did write his early novels in English, and he's written his most recent novels in Gikuyu and then translated them into English himself. But the original, the original was in Gikuyu. So that's, I think, a way for Ngugi to kind of negotiate or navigate this very kind of tricky question, because obviously Ngugi is also fluent in English. And yeah, so okay, so we will end there, and then we have a few minutes for questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for this enlightening session. As you have started with some interesting stories, and then you have highlighted some really important debatable questions on languages, the use of language, the use of English in India. So I request all the participants to ask their questions in the Q&A section to the panelists. And ma'am, you have also highlighted some important critical essays about the Thiango, Chinua Achebe. It's really very much insightful and the important. It is very much important to understand about the language. So, ma'am, the first question is from Ria. So she asked, in Raja Rao's preface to Kanthapura, Raja Rao articulates that our method of expression has to be a dialect which will someday prove to be as distinctive and colorful as Irish. I was wondering if this answers our opening questions regarding the politics of authenticity and English being a colonial language. Because Rao does mention that English is not an alien language to us, rather, it is an intellectual makeup.
Thank you for the great question. Yeah, yes, I think that is one way of seeing English. One way of getting out of the debate, as you said, yes, dialect, and thinking about the many Englishes that exist. And I think, surprisingly, so Raja Rao wrote that in 1935 when he published Kantapura, and then you have only a few experiments with that kind of English, interestingly, throughout the decades. So Mulkraj Anand tries to have some Punjabi idioms in his English, but if you've read Mulk Raja Anand, like it never feels, it feels a little false. It feels a little artificial. And then you have a lot of, in the English language writing, Upamanyu Chatterjee and other people writing in English throughout the 80s, you don't really get much of that experiment that Raja Rao had promised. So I don't know the answer to that, why that's the question. It's certainly in Rushdie you get a very expansive kind of language, which he says is like, it's like the Hindu epics. So it's like long sentences, long paragraphs, but it doesn't have that dialectical quality that Rao is describing in that preface. And you don't really strangely get that until the Chetan Bhagats and Anuja Chauhans unless someone can think of an exception, but I'm thinking of Amitav Ghosh and Arundhati Roy, and like the writers that people read in English don't really do that project of dialectizing English. English is very erudite in those, and it's very English. It's very like literary English in those texts. So I don't know why that's the case. Why haven't people picked up on that project? But I think you're right. I think Raja Rao has one solution for it. You know, and that other people haven't really picked it up. But I wonder if they might start to today. Or Bollywood's another example where like the English is so mixed with Hindi that, I mean, it feels like there's a lot of English, but you can't watch it as someone who doesn't know Hindi. You have to. It's still very Hindi. So I wonder if those kind of peripheral places are picking up on this dialect question more than the mainstream literature. That's a great question.
Thank you so much, ma'am. The second question is from Channa. So it is about, wait, ma'am.
It's in the Q&A.
Yes, ma'am. So the question is, Reformation in Bhasa came in the 19th century, but for Dalits, it came much later. So their work were translated, but translations show their reality. So can we consider it a deliberate move towards modernity, or it was just sharing their reality?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Dalit writing has its own history, which is very much located in Bhasha writing, in Marathi first, and then Hindi and other languages, Tamil and other languages. And so, but I guess I don't think I mean, Dalit language is still using the modernity of the bhashas in order to make the Dalit critique. So I actually think it's not a later modernity, but it's a mobilization of the modern languages to make that critique. And yeah, and I think that the Dalit literary landscape has absolutely been, a claim on modernity, for Dalit empowerment and against the critique of modernity, the Gandhian critique of modernity that refuses modernity, but it more importantly refuses Dalit subjectivity as modern. And so I think you're right. I think there's a claim in Dalit writing of the modernity, maybe not necessarily of language itself, but the modernity of voice, the modernity of subjectivity, humanity, and anger, and that all of that is all tied up with the modern. So I would say maybe, yeah, I mean, maybe the kind of early reformers in the 19th century who were, maybe who were more elite, were much more ambivalent about in their relationship to modernity most of the time. I mentioned Muhammad Hussein Azad, who modernized, or was one of the modernizers of Urdu. He like took this strong stance that Urdu needs to be modernized. Obviously, like the British loved him, but most Urdu writers hated him because they felt like he was selling Urdu out to something that was not Urdu anymore. But I think, but he also was, people are ambivalent. So he was like, do we just want to write Wordsworth poetry in Urdu, or do we want to do something? There was much more ambivalence, but I think your question points to the fact that in Dalit writing, there's much less ambivalence about the need to claim modernity. And so, yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Ma'am, related to the question which you have highlighted, so with that, I have one observation also with the colloquial language or the vernacular language and about the second language. So for the conversation, we use second language, so it's fine because we have to communicate with other people. But when it comes to the vernacular and the colloquial, so when we are using our own language, like the first language, so we are more attached with our emotion. Like with this context, I'm reminding one of the dramas of William Shakespeare, The Tempest, where in that scene there are conversation between Prospero and Sycorax. So Sycorax, Prospero tried to dominate Sycorax, and Sycorax use the language, quote unquote, I'll use your language to abuse you. So this is about he wants to learn Prospero's language because he can abuse, and so that Prospero can take it completely as abusive, so that it will hurt his emotion. So it is about that also.
Yeah, that's a great comparison. And you're absolutely right. I mean, there is a power in learning the colonizer's language. And we know that, I mean, look at the writers that like there's Indian writers, South Asian writers who really have learned the colonizer's language better than the colonizer. I mean, like, I guess the only thing is that the only problem with that is that just it requires such a level of privilege to get to that stage, where the colonizer no longer mocks you for not speaking it perfectly. And so I think we want to just say that that's not the only way to do and I think Ngugi's point is important. Like, at some point, it's also equally powerful to say, I refuse the colonizer's language, or I will do with the colonizer's language what I want to, not what the colonizer tells me to do. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think that is a very powerful statement in using the colonizer's language better. And also, there's just something to be said. I mean, we're talking about literature now, so this conversation has been more about the politics of literature, but the politics of language. But I mean, language is language after all. And as you said, Saloni, like, it's about your emotions too. It's about you expressing yourself. So sometimes we can't always make that political. Like, sometimes you just, you emote or you exclaim, and whatever language you do in it might not be a political choice. It might just be a representation of you. So I think that's also, despite all of these debates, I think it's also important just to recognize that that language is also very human and it's very emotional. We can't always make it political.
Yeah. Thank you so much, ma'am. So the next question is from Ria. So the question is, you have mentioned how colonialism, English, and modernity did shape native languages or bhasas. My question is, did the bhasha have any kind of impact on the English language, or what influence did bhasas have on English and the metropole during colonial and post-colonial period?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, of course. I mean, I think Indian English, or the many Indian Englishes, are shaped by the bhashas. And I think that Indian English is should be considered a real language. Like, it's and again, like, we don't celebrate enough the beautiful ways in which people speak English in India. Like, we have this one standard, this, like, Shakespearean kind of English, and then everything else is like speaking it badly. And so I think that the bhashas did affect what English became in India. And I just wish, now that we're having this conversation, you're all making me realize, I wish the writers celebrated that more. And and really, like that. Even, and I mean, it's sad that I have to turn to Chetan Bhagat to to address these issues, but like, I wish more writers were talking about the ways in which language affects, the ways in which the bhashas affects English, because I think that's just a wonderful story that hasn't really been told yet. Oh, I will recommend one book. It's just came out, called let me just check the name, um, because it's about this. It's called, let's see. Vernacular Englishes. Yeah, vernacular Englishes, language and democratic politics in post-liberalization India. An academic book about this relationship between English and the bhashas in India and how English has been strategically used by different parties. I was thinking also when you were talking earlier about Ambedkar. Ambedkar is a good example of someone who, we're talking about Dalit modernity, but also about Ambedkar's strategic use of English as a claim to that modernity. So that book, I think, covers some of that. And yeah, no, you're totally right. And there hasn't been enough scholarly study on that. So if someone wants to do a good project, I think it would be great to really look at what Indian English is and how it's been shaped by the bhashas.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, ma'am. Yeah, so the next question from Bhavya, and the question is, can you please tell something on the role of social social media in popularizing English?
Oh yeah, yes, thank you. Um, yeah, so I think on one hand, social media popularizes English, but as I also, and again, this needs to be studied more. So I think if you have students or people you want to give projects to, um, but I think that we want to study what counts as English on social media, because as we mentioned on WhatsApp and other forums, like people often write bhashas in English script on WhatsApp. So people do you consider that English, or I mean they're using the Roman script, but they're also communicating in a mix of languages or in other languages, Gujarati, writing Gujarati text in English script. So I think the question of whether social media is making English higher is still to be debated. I think social media is popularizing certain kinds of fast type languages in the Roman script. But I would be interested, in all of you, like what languages do you WhatsApp in, and is it only English, or is it multiple languages? My sense is that people are doing a lot of mixed language typing on WhatsApp and on messaging, and I think social media is contributing to that. So, um, but I think that's a research question that someone should ask.
Thank you, ma'am. So we are running out of the time. So the other question will take up through mail. So it's time for a short break. So we'll continue after the break. Thank you so much, ma'am.
Thank you.
Go on, they will keep asking questions. But see, it's already 5 minutes past. 7. It's 8:30, 35 almost. Huh? So we had to stop 10 minutes earlier. So just be careful and also don't ask him questions from your side because it seems as if we are dominating and the
Welcome back, everyone, for the third session of today's GIAN course. I welcome you, ma'am, again. Over to you, ma'am. The session is yours.
Okay, can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, ma'am, it's visible.
Great. Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks. Okay, so to this topic of today's class, this session is new Hindi writing, new themes in 21st century Hindi literature. Focus on Divya Prakash Dubey, Nikhil Sachan, Uday Prakash, and Purushottam Agarwal. So although the course is on, I mentioned today is our language day and our discussion of language. The course, of course, is on post-1990s English literature, Indian writing in English. But as I said before, I think it's important to look at parallel traditions. There's always this danger of making English exceptional, even though we are making it exceptional by making this whole course on English literature. But we want to also talk about its connections with other things going on. And I think this session is really a chance to look to do some of the work we did last time, even with the social media question that that someone asked, to make sure that we don't think that everything new that is happening now is happening only in English. And we shouldn't think that everything technologically based that is happening now is happening in English, because that is not the case, as we will see. So um, we saw this in the excerpt I showed you from Nakohas, the novel, the Hindi novel by Purushottam Agarwal, that had all these English words embedded in the Hindi. So just to introduce you to this novel, Nakohas, came out in 2016. Most of the writing, all the most of the texts I'm going to be talking about here actually have not been translated into English. And as far as I know, Nakohas has not been translated into English. So Nakohas is a satirical kind of, so Purushottam Agarwal is a writer and critic, a very progressive leftist writer, very active in writing about politics. And the novel too is quite political. It is a satirical kind of dystopian novel with political resonances in today's India. So the novel begins when it's a very strange novel. The novel begins when a crocodile leisurely walks down a small street and begins to chew on the leg of an elephant who happens to be lying there. No one seems to notice, and that's how the novel starts. And you're like, what is happening? And then we realize that it's a dream. Suket is our protagonist. He wakes up from the dream, reaches for a glass of water, and it's 3 a.m. And in the next scene, over 200 students are protesting Professor Suket for being anti-national, and they say, Murdabad, Murdabad, national sentiments hurt karne walon ko, jhute maro salon ko. And that's the beginning of the novel. So I think it's not an accident that he mixes this surreal dream of a crocodile eating an elephant's leg with the surreal nature of political protest in today's India. Agrawal's novel is located right in our contemporary moment, in which threats to free speech and violence against secular and progressive writers have intensified. Thinking of the assassination of Kannada writer M.M. Kalburgi in 2015, and the award Vapsi movement that followed, when many artists and writers and scholars returned awards they'd been given from the Indian government to protest the lack of support and for progressive and secular thinking. And then, of course, there was the figurative death of Burumul Murugan that year, and the murder of Gauri Lankesh in 2017. So all of these moments, this feeling that the kind of progressive thought, secular thought is under threat, that's the moment that Purushottam Agarwal is writing this novel into. And all these events confirm what we see in the novel is a lawless dystopian reality where open debate and discussion are seen as a threat to cultural and religious values, and that's what's being criticized in this novel. Nakohas is the fictional ministry. It's a made up word. It's a fictional ministry, which is the National Commission on Hurt Sentiments. And so Nakohas stands for National Commission on Hurt Sentiments. And it's a democratic, so it's a non-democratic censorship body in a democratic country. A democratic country, the novel says, should be open to self-questioning and self-criticism. But in this dystopic world, Nakohas was established to combat free thinking and free self-expression. So for this government, democracy means defending your sentiments from being hurt by others, hence the National Commission on Hurt Sentiments, at whatever cost. It's a country in which goli matters more than boli. So it's a very critical novel, a satirical novel, and also a strange surrealistic novel. So all the novel takes place mostly in these different pieces of time in which the characters like are having out of body experiences. They get talked to by lizards and and the whole thing. But the surreality of the world of the novel is a commentary for Agarwal on the surreality of kind of democratic dissent in India. So Uday Prakash is another contemporary Hindi writer who aims a critical eye at contemporary society. And his novels actually, most, not all, but a couple of them are translated into English. Pili Chhatri Wali Ladki is translated into English. And so Pili Chhatri Wali Ladki is the story of Rahul, an MA student who changes his subject from anthropology to Hindi when he falls in love with Anjali, a Brahmin classmate at the university. Their love flourishes even though Rahul experiences the corruption of university leadership and of campus student groups connected to political parties who harass and steal money from the students. So he and his friends become increasingly empowered against these college gundas, and in the end, Rahul and Anjali run away together against their parents' wishes. The novel is about caste difference and love across caste difference, but like Agarwal, there's a kind of strange surrealistic quality to it, and so it's not at all like Chamin or one of these novels about cross caste love and like the transcendence of cross caste love. It's actually a searing critique of globalization, capitalism, and Hindu nationalism and Brahmin hegemony, but it's also very whimsical in the way it describes Rahul and Anjali's love. So I wanted to just give you an example of a passage here, to give you an example of the kind of writing that we have here. As Rahul emerged from the classroom into the corridor, someone snuck up from behind and bumped into him. Rahul turned around to look. It was Anjali with her laugh. In the library, Rahul was hunched over a desk, taking some notes, when suddenly someone blew into his ear. Pff, so intense, it sent shivers up his spine. It was Anjali. Rahul was taking a walk when a cold, pointy thing jabbed him in the neck. He turned around. Anjali was standing there, laughing, holding the closed parasol, the tip pointed at him, on guard, trying to frighten him. Back in the library, looking at books in the narrow space between the shelves, someone's shoulder gave him a little shove. It was Anjali's. So the writing is very distinctive here, as you will notice, because in all of these cases, he notices something of Anjali's that then he experiences as Anjali, if that makes sense. So, like, someone snuck up behind him and bumped into him. He turned around to look. It was Anjali. Someone blew into his ear. It was Anjali. A cold, pointy thing jabbed him. Turned around. It was Anjali. So and the whole novel is written in this kind of like, it's a very quirky style. It's like nothing is experienced in the immediate as human contact, but through a kind of a mediation. And it gives a kind of, I have to say, what it does is it gives a kind of magic quality to Rahul and Anjali's love. You feel like there's something special. Even the yellow umbrella that she's always carrying around, he often sees the umbrella moving across. He looks out his window of his college room and sees the umbrella moving across the campus, and then realizes that Anjali is under it. So in all of these things, like the yellow umbrella, there's no political meaning to the yellow umbrella. It's not meant to be a metaphor for anything. It's just kind of a lovely way to describe the love they have for each other. And it's surprising in a novel that is otherwise so critical of casteism and overall political violence. Uday Prakash has a style where he writes these very whimsical passages, and then the next page he'll write a long rant against like American imperialism and the bombing of Iraq and all of these things. So, but that shift in style, I think, is also a refusal to let the love story be a victim of violence. And the fact that Rahul and Anjali do run away together, it feels like in a world that is so kind of so filled with different kinds of violence, both on the large level and on the smaller level, it's kind of lovely to have this magical love story appear in it. Now, so this novel is written in Hindi, as I said, and this is another way of dealing with that authenticity question that we were talking about earlier. Despite the fact that the novel is written in Hindi, it's not a celebration of Hindi as opposed to English, because the thing is that Hindi in the novel is fully caught up with Brahmin hegemony. So at some point, Rahul asks himself, Rahul, who's not Brahmin, am I working toward an MA in Hindi literature or Brahmin literature? And the reason he asks this question, it's of course a sarcastic, rhetorical question, but the reason he asked that is because everything in Hindi literature, like the whole structure of the Hindi department, who's in the Hindi department, what literature they can study, is all tied up with kind of Brahmin hegemony, more in the Hindi department than in any of the other departments. He's the only non-Brahmin in the entire Hindi department. So Hindi is itself tied up with caste power. And that's important too, because you don't want to make this mistake of saying English is full of colonialism and Hindi is only the language of the subaltern. There's a lot of caste privilege, Savarna privilege in Hindi itself. This is a description of the Hindi department. They didn't look like they were living in today's world. From the clothes they wore to the way they walked and talked, they were completely other. Again, this is supposed to be funny. It's like a funny way of describing these academics. But I think the point is important, that there seems to be some kind of disjuncture between the Hindi department and like the real world of Hindi life and it's true of any literature department perhaps, but I think the novel makes a very strong critique of the Hindi department. And then in another novella that Prakash has written called Mohandas, the narrator says, I'm writing this story, and this is also written in Hindi, I'm writing this story in a language that imprisoned me inside, just like Iraqis were imprisoned in Abu Ghraib, or like Jews in 1943 were imprisoned inside a German gas chamber. So this is quite a strong statement about the power of Hindi to oppress and imprison. And again, this is one of the themes of the novel, is the out of dateness, but also the real violence that is embedded in Hindi and the close association between Hindi hegemony and Brahmin hegemony. So these two writers, Agrawal and Prakash, are more kind of the literary writers who are writing in Hindi today, and there are others as well, including ones we'll talk about when we talk about Dalit writing. They're profoundly critical of the current government. They're profoundly critical of Hindu nationalism, and they're politically active in writers' conferences and on social media, kind of raising political awareness around those questions. And the novels they're like, all their works are really wonderful. And it's clear that they come from a political stance of very critical towards today's conditions in India. But the current Hindi writers are not only political writers. There's also popular writers, more in the style of Chetan Bhagat and others that we discussed yesterday. So one of those writers is Divya Prakash Dubey, who has admitted modeling himself off Chetan Bhagat, even though he writes in Hindi. And so he is the author of 2 books of short stories and 3 novels. He grew up in small UP towns like Hardoi and Shahjahanpur, and he's an MBA grad. So in his texts, which also have not been translated into English as far as I know, there are similar themes that we saw in Bhagat, ambition, technology, I should have said romance, especially from the male perspective, like what it means to love someone and be in love with someone, how to navigate new spaces of consumption. These are all themes in Dubey similar to Bhagat. Now, Dubey is an interesting figure because he does a lot of promotional work for his own writings on the internet. And that's the key to many new authors. It's a new kind of publishing landscape where it's not so much about it's not so much about like having an agent and getting distribution through bookstores and the kind of old model of distribution. It's actually more, a lot of that work is done on the internet and then through internet sales. And so actually some of these authors are bypassing traditional circulation networks in terms of getting their book distributed, but doing it kind of themselves on the internet. And in all of these works, Dubé's writings, like Bhagat's, like Chauhan's, they're not separate from contemporary India, but they're like deeply immersed in it. So everything, social media, smartphones, just, consumption, all of the things that like young people are experiencing are kind of the world of this novel, but also difficult things like romance. I mean, we'll see. And then the sales of these books, as I said, tend to be mostly online. And they're priced between 70 and 100 rupees. We didn't talk about the price point for Chetan Bhagat's books, but it is important to know that when the first few came out, I'm not sure if he still does this, first few came out, he wanted to price them all at, I believe, 90 or 99 rupees, which is another way of thinking about accessibility for who can buy the books. But this is something that is part of the marketing for Dubé's Hindi works as well. So, so this is his website. This is just a screenshot of his website, and you can see the kind of marketing that he does here. So he's advertising his fifth book, Ibn Battuti, and he's saying now you can order it here. And he talks a little bit about in the blog post about his nerves when he was writing his first book. Would people buy it? But now he feels more confident. And then again, just you can see the mix of Hindi, English, Devanagari, and Roman, you can see all over. And again, I just want to, that's why when the question was like, is social media making people more English? In some ways it will, because yes, you have to read home about blog videos, that's all in English. Hindi author, and his name is in English, but then, up at the top you have Storybazi, and then you have the name of the text in English, and then you have the text in English, except for those three words as guiding philosophy at the bottom. So I think the mix is really important to emphasize for like this new kind of language that people are speaking. And this is how this website is how you buy the books. They're very hard to find in bookstores. It's mostly online sales. If you follow him on Facebook and Twitter, you can get updates on the books. And that's very much a new model for young people in terms of publishing. So terms and conditions apply is 13 short stories by Dubé. And they, again, you can see, I mean, this is the book, I just again, to give you a sense of the mixing of language, the book is all in Hindi, in Devanagari. The title of the book is in English, and the title of this story is in English, but I don't have the table of contents, but some of the stories are titled in English, some in Hindi. So I just want to emphasize that the new model is very mixed. And actually you can see on the second page that I have here, there are even words that are written out in Roman script and dates written out in Roman script. So, but the stories are absolutely Hindi. So, and you can see the style here. It says, "तुम मुझसे कुछ बोलती क्यों नहीं? इतना फासला क्यों आने दिया तुमने? सब तुम्हारी गलती है। मुझे गलत करते हुए न रोकना भी तुम्हारी ही गलती है। कोई कॉलेज में बोल ही नहीं सकता कि हम कभी लड़ भी सकते हैं। आज हालात ये है कि हम एक ही घर में अलग सोते हैं। मेरा टिफिन अलग आता है। तुम अपना खाना अलग बनाती हो। प्रति तुम इसलिए तो घर से नहीं भागे थे। हमने इसलिए तो शादी नहीं की थी। याद है तुम्हें थोड़ा भी जिस दिन हमने पहले बच्चे का नाम सोचा था, तुमने उसको आने ही नहीं दिया। करियर इतना इम्पोर्टेंट होता है क्या बताओ?" So you get the idea of how this starts. Like you get it's a very simple Hindi, a very colloquial, like the way people actually talk. And you can see the subject here, which is about this distance between this couple who used to be very close and now basically live apart. You can also see that it's a male voice asking her whether her career is that important. And I think that, I think one of the things that we see in Bhagat as well as here is like trying to figure out new kind of gender relations among a couple in the context in which women are refusing kind of traditional gender roles. So yeah, so this is the kind of style of Dubé's writings. And again, the importance of writing about relationships. This is something we discussed yesterday, but like, this is, I mean, it's Hindi writing about like real kind of middle class people's, it's like writing middle class life into the Hindi novel. There's nothing, unlike Prakash and Agarwal, there's no political critique here. It's just like a little intimate story about a relationship and a breakup, and about someone, this author, who, as you see from the next paragraph, feels very depressed and is contemplating suicide. So yeah, the importance, I mean, and this, when people have studied this kind of writing, it's important to note that the characters speak in a Hindi that is not written but actually spoken. So it feels almost strange to read. It feels very colloquial. It feels much more like a WhatsApp story than a literature, a piece of literature, which, you can see, compared contrast to Uday Prakash with The Yellow Parasol, which is much more literary. It's known as Nayi Wali Hindi, which is a specific reaction against the formal and Sanskritized Hindi that was once part of the national radio, newspapers, and TV that made people hesitant to use any foreign word, and that relates to English words, but also Urdu words. So there was this Nayi Wali Hindi moves away from the kind of purification drive that took place in the newly independent country, when people were trying to say, okay, now we need to get rid of foreign words, whether those foreign words were in English or Urdu. So you can see that here. There's so much intimacy with English, even in the Hindi itself. So Nikhil Sajan is another writer of kind of contemporary, like pulp and popular, and he had, Hindi medium school training, as many of the Hindi writers did. So unlike Amitav Ghosh, who says, like, I could only write in English, I mean, these are Hindi educated Hindi, but also part of that that new middle class, writing about young people, writing about young people's desires, writing about romance. That's very much a part of the worlds that people are writing. He's also in the tech industry now. He first published a short story collection, Namak Swad Anusar, and then his novel, that's pictured here, is called UP65. So this, again, it's interesting to think about relationships between Hindi and English in this moment. We talked a lot about Chetan Bhagat yesterday, and one of the things I told you about is how much his success, just his success in selling books, how much that affected, like, publishing in India overall. Like, the numbers that people were now thinking about after Bhagat, that you could sell millions of books, you could sell lakhs of books. This was unthinkable before Bhagat. Bhagat also just opened up the market for the kind of writing that Bhagat does, which is like young people, young characters, young authors, their hopes and dreams, romance, all of that. And even the Hindi writers. So I mentioned Dubey, Divya Prakash Dubey says he's influenced by Bhagat. Nikhil Sajan actually starts UP65 by saying, he tells his readers in the prologue he didn't want to be stereotyped as another Chetan Bhagat. He actually says that in the prologue, which is, and he specifically said, I didn't want to look like I'm copying 5 Point Someone. 5 Point Someone was Bhagat's first novel that was set at IIT, because UP65 is the story of Nishant and his friend who are studying at the IIT in UP. So you can see that the structure is similar. But that, like, homage and acknowledgement of Bhagat's influence in this world, I think it's important to note for writers who feel like now they can write things that they always want to write because Bhagat has opened up the market. And this is also incorporated into the text itself. So this is actually from the first page of the text. Are you reading 5 Point Someone? Bande laughed loudly while asking. Yes, I like reading English novel. I squirmed while replying. Yes, Hindi or English is not the issue. I laughed at the book. Why? What's so wrong in the book? Look, Nishant Babu, what happens in IIT is not what is written in this book. So a couple of things to note here. As far as I know, UP65 has not been translated. This is a quote from someone who used it. Who translated, like, just this passage themselves. But the conversation is funny because, first of all, obviously it's a direct reference to not only Bhagat's novels, but also Bhagat's own self-referentiality in his novels that we talked about yesterday. The fact that Bhagat always has a character reading one of his novels and commenting on them. The second thing to point out here is that like in Puckett, it's kind of a critique of 5 Point Someone, saying like, oh, that's not realistic, which is a kind of funny, you know, like, so the woman on the train at the beginning of One Night in a Call Center told Puckett that, uh, supposedly told Bhagat that his story is not really what happens at IIT, or he should write about other people too, and he agrees. And then we have a similar kind of commentary here. But the third point I want to point out is that when Pandey laughs because he's reading 5 Point Someone, Nishant defends himself by saying, "I like reading English," and then Pandey says, "No, Hindi or English is not the issue. I laughed at the book," and I thought that's just an important moment. Again, thinking about the earlier conversation we had about the cult of authenticity and this, that like, and I said at the end of that conversation that we don't want to make the mistake of over politicizing language also. And I think we might be at a moment now for writers like Dubey and Sachan where it's not like they're not writing in Hindi for, or even Uday Prakash, as I mentioned, like they're not writing in Hindi for a political purpose. They're writing in Hindi like because they want to write in Hindi and they could very well be writing in English. And for Prakash, Hindi is not the savior, is not the language that's going to solve all the political problems in India either, if that makes sense. So I think this line here, like English or Hindi is not the issue. I laughed at the book. I'm laughing at you because you're reading Chetan Bhagat. I'm not laughing at you because you're reading it in English. And I think I think that's just like maybe I don't know, maybe a new relationship between the languages. Again, I'm only talking about Hindi here, so obviously every other language in India has its own relationships to English, but just focusing on Hindi, I think it just might be a new stage where like that distinction, that sense of like anger or that sense of like English is elite and Hindi isn't, it's subaltern. I mean, all of that is getting kind of mixed up in a way that we saw in Dubey's text, which is all mix of Roman, Devanagari, English, Hindi, and in this comment as well. So I think that's I don't know. I just think it's an interesting phenomenon again that probably deserves some study. Sachan has mentioned in his books and interviews that one of his goals for writing in Hindi, so it's like why write in Hindi, is to cultivate a readership of Hindi literature such as exists in English. So in other words, Sachan has specifically said like I want there to be young, like just like young people read Bhagat on the Delhi Metro and on buses, in colleges, young people are reading Bhagat all the time. He wants people to read in Hindi. And again, the writers that we talked about earlier, Agarwal and Prakash, are very literary. They're not going to be the kinds of things people read on the Metro. But this UP 65 and terms and conditions apply are exactly the kinds of texts that people might actually read on the Metro. And then the other thing that Sajan has said, which I think is a great line, one of his goals for writing in Hindi has been to make reading in Hindi as cool as reading in English. And I want to emphasize that because for a long time, there is this sense that like, because English has so corresponded with class privilege, there has been this sense that like, and we see this in Bhagat too, like if you speak don't speak St. Stephen's English, then you are somehow like, inferior. So the idea that Hindi is like inferior, I think is part of what these authors like Sachan and these books are very popular. Dubey and Sachan, they're very popular books and they are being read by people. And I think they are probably contributing to making Hindi cool again. But that is also another research project that someone can do. Unsurprisingly, there are critics who, just like there are critics who say Bhagat is ruining English and ruining the Indian novel in English, there are also critics who say that writers like these are ruining the Hindi novel, which used to be much more sophisticated and literary, and now it's just like written, uninteresting stories. But I think the main point to get out of this is not actually the demise of Hindi, but that these kind of writers might actually be saving Hindi. And we see this in this article in Aaj Tak on Divya Prakash Dubey, where they literally says, the author says, to those who say that Hindi is slowly dying, let them read the new styles of Divya Prakash Dubey. Upon reading Terms and Conditions and Musafir Cafe, you will have to agree that Hindi isn't going anywhere, but it's being revived in a new form. And this is, I think, and the importance of someone saying like, I want Hindi to be cool again, because there is this teleological narrative that we think, oh, now with social media, now with new literature, with the internet, everything's going to just become English. But there are these counter trends, and I think one of the things we can do as critics is to like, sometimes we have a tendency to like criticize things like, oh, I wish this wasn't happening. I wish everyone wasn't on social media all the time. I wish everyone wasn't buying books on the internet. I wish the literature was still good. There's a complaining tendency in academics. But I also think that these are writers who are trying to carve out spaces for alternatives in the world of social media and in the world of the internet and in the world of a seeming impossible hegemony of English. They're actually trying to carve out kind of spaces of, you know, Hindi writing, Hindi coolness, even if it's not good writing, Hindi coolness that I think is really significant. And indeed, like on the back cover of UP 65, you see like pronouncements that if you look at the back cover, I don't have an image of it, but the glory days of Hindi literature are here again, are the kinds of things that are said on that. So this really feels like not like the vernacularizing of English and the Englishizing of Hindi, the bringing together these two languages, the kind of mixing and melding of them might ironically be exactly what is needed to save Hindi. So the other thing is the importance of technology and the internet in terms of publishing industry in Hindi. So in 2010, Hindi Yugam Press would only sell 50 to 70 copies of Hindi books. But now with e-commerce, they sell 25,000 copies and is also able to give royalties to their Hindi writers, which had never before happened. So the critique of capitalism and money in the publishing industry, which many people make, overlooks the fact that for a long time, I mean, we see this with Premchand, speaking of Premchand, and Premchand was poor, like he never made money on his writings. And there's a tendency in scholarship to valorize that figure of the kind of modernist writer who you know did art for art's sake and not for money. But the fact is that those become unsustainable positions, and then we wonder why everyone wants to get MBAs instead of English degrees. So the fact that people, you know, that people can get paid for publishing in Hindi and actually make royalties off it does, you know, lead us hopefully to a sense of a broader shift in, you know, publishing trends, more literature being produced, and I think it can open up the process of different kinds of writers. Everyone doesn't have to be doing the same thing. Everyone doesn't have to be like these two kind of Chetan Bhagat influence. There can be many kinds of different writing, and so I think this is an exciting moment in Hindi writing. It'll be interesting to see what directions it goes. So that was what I hope I've given you is two different perspectives on contemporary Hindi writing. One that's literary, and again, we'll continue that in our discussion of Dalit writing tomorrow. And then one that's much more popular. And both are actually, you know, very kind of thriving and interesting bodies of Hindi writing for the 21st century. And I will stop there.
Thank you, ma'am, for another insightful session. We'll take up question. I request all the participants, please send your queries in Q&A section. I request to our host, Dr. Nidhi Bansal. Do you have any question on your own end?
So far, there are none.
Okay, ma'am. So for this session, we don't have any queries. If we get any question, we'll discuss through our through the mail. So for now, it's time for. Wait, there's a query in chat. Okay, it's a compliment from Aparna. Amazingly presented, ma'am. Thank you so much. So now it's time for a snap for the happy faces. So I request Nidhi Bansal ma'am to give a right so that all the participants can switch on their camera.
Sure, I'm doing that. Have we clicked photographs then? Yes, we have clicked, I believe. Right. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much all for sparing some time for the moment of togetherness. Now, moving forward, there's a compliment from Dr. Navdat Sonwane. He's saying thanks for good lectures. Now I'm moving forward for the vote of the thanks. So it's about, I'd like to thank our expert Professor Ulkan Jharia ma'am for discussing the prominent Indian authors Premchand, Vibhuti Bhushan Bandyopadhyay, Tara Shankar Bandyopadhyay, T.S. Pillai, U.R. Anandmurthy. Uh, your thoughts and perspective are really intriguing and thought-provoking. You have discussed so many debatable questions and important lecture on different perspective on bhasas. I'm also thankful to all the course coordinators, Dr. Preeti Bhatt and Dr. Nidhi Bansal, for coming up with the idea of this course on South Asian literature and film. I am very much thankful to the National Sponsoring Agency, GIAN, Global Initiative for Academic Networks, which is an initiative under Ministry of Education. It would have been impossible to organize it without their support. Thank you to all the participants for the involvement they have shown and the willingness to attend the course. We'll begin again at 6:30 p.m. IST tomorrow. Please join 10 minutes before the scheduled time. The research scholar who are assigned with the duties to draft a report, you are requested to kindly share it on time. Thank you for your support also. We'll see you again tomorrow. Stay tuned. Keep learning and happy reading. Good night. Take care.
Thank you, Ulka. Such wonderful sessions. Undoubtedly. I really enjoyed having that idea of Hindi, English, and I believe a good blend of both the languages in different ways. So it was really interesting to see that.
Thank you.
Hello,
Thanks.
Hello.
Yes. Yes,
Hello,
Napal.
ma'am.
Yes. Yes, Dr.
Actually, ma'am, please share this PPT for information in the last previous PPT. Please share on group email.
We can discuss it later, please. Thank you.
Hello.
The videos are on YouTube, so you can look at them again. Okay.